On tonight's show, Alex Kajitani. Alex is the 2009 California Teacher of the Year and a top 4 finalist for National Teacher of the Year. He speaks internationally on a variety of education and leadership issues and delivers powerful keynote speeches and workshops to educators and business leaders. Also known as the Rappin Mathematician, Alex's songs, videos, and online programs are used around the world to help students succeed. Alex is the author of Owning It, Proven Strategies to Ace and Embrace Teaching, and co-author of Chicken Soup for the Soul, Inspiration for Teachers. He also has a popular TEDx talk and has been featured in many media stories, including the CBS Evening News, where Katie Couric delivered.
I love that guy. Nice shades, too. That is the CBS.
Alex is also the author of 101 Tips for Teaching Online, helping students think, learn, and grow, no matter where they are. So without further ado, we'd like to welcome to a conversation with Brian, Alex Kajitani. Alex, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much, Brian. It's an honor and a pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.
We have been trying to do this for a while, and I'm so thrilled that you're able to do this because we have a lot to talk about tonight, and I want my audience to get to know you because you have a fabulous story and you do some great things for our profession. So thanks so much again for joining us.
It's an honor. Thanks.
So, Alex, at the beginning of each one of my shows, I ask my guests to talk about their personal story and professional journey as much as you want to share. So who is Alex Kajitani?
Yeah, that's a great question. Something I wonder myself all the time. But yeah, it's interesting. I actually studied sociology in college. And so after I got my first job as a social worker, I was living in Santa Barbara, California, and the pay was so bad that I had to get a job at night bussing tables in a fancy restaurant. And, in a couple of hours, I would see these servers make more money in a night than I made all week. And so I thought, okay, I gotta switch a few things around here, instead of working two jobs. And so I started to phase the social work side of my life out. And I started eventually to manage the restaurant, and I was in the corporate restaurant world for a while. And so, as a restaurant manager, I learned all of these skills, like, how to manage the room, leadership skills, how to put together a training program, things like that. And then in my 30s, I finally, sort of admitted to myself what I always knew, which is that I wanted to be a teacher. And so I moved down to San Diego and became a teacher. And it was absolutely amazing, how transferable the skills were. A parent would come and complain to me about, something that their kid said about my class or something. And I think, oh, come on. I have people yelling at me for finding something in their food, and so it's just really been, I'm so, ever since I became a teacher, I really have I think just sort of been doing what I always knew I was meant to do. For me, people ask all the time, when did you know you wanted to become a teacher? And, honestly, for me, there was never this big epiphany or this big moment. And I think it was just sort of something that I always knew. And so getting to do that for, being in education for nearly 20 years now has just been really an honor and a joy. Not always easy, as we all know, but something that I cherish.
So take us back a little bit in terms of when you grew up as a student. Talk to us a little bit about you as a student and how you viewed education before you actually got into it as a teacher.
Yeah, it's interesting. I always loved school. It was something that I was good at, right? I did well on tests. I enjoyed being in school as a student. And so that was, something that it sort of always placed me at an advantage as a teacher, because it's, I've been mentally cataloging like lessons that, my 6th grade teacher did and things like that. At the same time, I also have always been very aware that's not the experience that a lot of students have. A lot of students do not have this, wow, I really love school, I want to, spend my career in schools as well. And so that's something that I've always, really thought about and been sensitive to as a teacher. I also grew up in Southern California. My dad is Japanese, my mom is Jewish, and I was actually named after the author Alex Haley. And so they were him and my parents were friends
Okay.
when they were living in San Francisco. He was a struggling unknown writer, and they lived next door to each other. So
Yeah.
that's where they got the name, the idea to name me Alex. And so
Wow.
I always say I'm a Jewish Japanese American named after an African American, but growing up in Southern California, I speak Spanish. So I'm all over the place when
Yeah.
it comes to, how I grew up and my own experiences in school.
Well, those experiences really shape who you are, right? And you talk
Absolutely.
about that a lot when we talk about building relationships with students and how we should make sure that we honor what they bring to the table. But let's start with your book. Went through a couple of your books, 101, 101 Tips for Teaching Online, and your other book, Owning It. But in your book, 101 Tips for Teaching Online, you really talk about, you know, your failure when you first started in terms of trying to connect with students. And it led to this idea of rapping for your students in math class. Talk a little bit about that and the is it the itty bitty dot,
Oh,
and,
yeah.
and how you really try to make it really engaging for students, and it didn't really go over well from what you thought, but somehow it traveled throughout the student body, and kids really felt like it was kind of cool.
Yeah, absolutely. When you talk about the Rappin Mathematician, not something I ever set out to be, but yeah, several years ago, I was a new teacher just struggling to survive in my own classroom, and I couldn't seem to get my students to pay attention or sit still in their seats,
Yeah.
and yet I realized a rap song would come out on Monday, and by Tuesday they seemed to have every single word memorized, and so I thought, okay, I got to play on this strength, right? And so one day, as you said, we were studying adding and subtracting decimals, and I wrote a song called The Itty Bitty Dot about the decimal point, and I practiced all night, and I really thought I was going to be the man.
Now what in the world is that itty bitty dot? Yo, I just can't remember and it's making me distraught. I saw it in the price of the item I just bought. It's the decimal point. Yeah, now you're getting hot. When you add and subtract them.
And, you're laughing because you know exactly how this story turns out.
Well, it's funny because I think we all do that. We all do some things where we think it's going to go over well, and it's like, ooh, and sometimes we think it like doesn't go over well, but for some reason it actually connected.
Yeah, I mean, it was a disaster. The students were laughing at me hysterically. And then later that day, I walked to the teacher's lounge for lunch, and I walked by the student lunch tables. They were all singing the itty bitty dot. And of course, the next day, they actually ran into my class with the same amount of energy that they normally reserve for running out of my class with. And they were saying things like, oh, are you going to rap again? Yesterday was the best day ever. And so that's when, I started to realize this, really what's become one of my central philosophies as an educator, which is that I had to stop trying to take the curriculum and forcing it into the students' lives, and instead take the students' lives and see where that fits into the curriculum.
There must be a rule, so listen to my rhyme and use it as a tool. Just line up the dot and give it all you got. I said line up the dot and give it all you got. And when you take the difference, in other words subtraction, just use the same rule and bring on the action. Just line up.
So my students actually started making all of the rap music videos that we put on YouTube that have gotten, hundreds of thousands of views on YouTube and are being used all over the world. And it really, at the heart of it was this desperate teacher's attempt to, connect with their students.
Yeah, and that's important, because if we can't connect with students, we really can't have them connect with the curriculum.
Yeah.
Right. And so, talk to me a little bit about, those 101 strategies. And when I looked at, and I took some notes, when I looked at a number of your strategies, and you broke the book up into kind of 4 different parts, or actually you broke the book up into 11 different chapters. And some of the chapters that really stuck out to me were the building relationships, engaging students, and ensuring equity. Can you talk a little bit about those 3 areas the book is fantastic, but I think those three areas are really critical in order for us to make sure that kids really feel like they belong.
Yeah, and the truth is, I mean, those three things, building relationships, engaging students, ensuring equity, they are universal, whether we're teaching online, whether we're teaching in person or in between. And so, but with this book, really what I was looking to do was, all of when the COVID shutdown first happened, and teachers were sort of scrambling to, how, okay, I got to teach online now. And there was this move toward, okay, how do I take the old reality of teaching and put it online?
Yeah.
And what we soon learned was that was the wrong question to ask. What we needed to be asking was, how do we build a new reality where
Bingo.
students thrive, in this world, which, may or may not ever go back to the way that it was. I think we're seeing now, absolutely, it's not going back. And so at the same time, parents would call me during the COVID shutdown and say, hey, I walked by my kid's bedroom and the teacher was on the screen talking, but my kid had their camera turned off and they were turned away from the computer screen, totally unengaged. They were just doing something on their phone. Teachers would call me and say, I can't even get my kids to show up. And if
Right.
they show up, I can't get them to turn my camera on. And so, what we saw really was this real challenge and toward, okay, how do I get my students involved and engaged in the class while we're teaching online? But then how do I keep them engaged
Sure.
all the way through the entire hour, or for some of our elementary schools, all the way through the entire day? And so I always fall back on something that my first ever principal, David Gex, said, which is that a truly remarkable teacher can teach with a plot of sand and a stick, right?
Yeah.
That's all you need, really. If many of us listening today, if I gave you a piece of paper and a pencil and said, can you teach me about XYZ concept? You probably could do it, because that's what we're trained to do as teachers. We're
Yeah.
trained to explain things. We're trained to make things engaging. And so Zoom is really just another version, a technologically advanced version
Sure.
of a plot of sand and a stick. And so that really put me into examining, okay, how do we build relationships with students, whether we're online?
Yeah.
How do we keep them engaged? And then, in terms of, looking at equity and ensuring equity, I think one of the things that the pandemic did was it really shined a heavy spotlight on, students who had access to adults in their lives who could help them, get the academic content and get through school, internet access,
Yep.
devices, and just sometimes, a place to, a place to be while school was in session. I knew students who had to go to their local library in order to get on the internet
Sure.
to take part in class. Now, sitting in your local library is nice for an hour or two, but when you've got to do it all day, every day, just to be a part of school, we've got students who rely on lunches and breakfasts and snacks in order to get their nourishment for the day. When school closed down, things like that became quite a challenge. And so I could go on, but those were three things that were really critical.
When we talk about equity, I always think about fairness, and I always think about how do we ensure that every single child, no matter who they are, has access to some of the same essential skills, essential curriculum that all kids should have, right? And so when we talk about individual teachers, and I look at your book and look at both of your books, and they're wonderful books. How do you help? And in your books, you talk about this idea of how do we work together, but how do we make sure that we have a school full of Alex Kajitanis and not just one or two Alex Kajitanis, and then it depends on who we get as a teacher to make sure that we are engaged, that we don't hit, it's like that hitting that educational lottery. How do we make sure that we keep our individuality as teachers, but we also make sure as a teams, we do some basic things to make sure that all kids have access to grade level curriculum and other things that, we some kids get and some kids don't get because they hit the teacher lottery.
Yeah, it's interesting. Lavelle Brown, who is the superintendent of the Ithaca City School District, he had one of the best definitions of equity that I ever heard. he said recently that equity is reducing the predictability of who succeeds and who fails.
I love that.
Let me say
Yeah.
that again, reducing the predictability of who succeeds and who fails. And one of the ways that there's a couple of things, one of the ways, there's a lot of things, but one of the ways that, is exactly what you said is how do we ensure high quality, effective teachers, in every classroom, in as many classrooms as possible, across our campuses
Yeah.
and things like that. And that is, that is both a struggle, but also, kind of the ultimate goal.
Sure.
One of the things that we also saw during the pandemic is that being a highly effective teacher also means, being a teacher who takes care of yourself. I mean, not just during the pandemic, but we've always known that. And so one of the things I wanted to share with you and your audience. So I got this email recently from one of my former students. It's really short. I just wanted to
Sure.
read it to you, but it says, "Hi, Mr. Kajitani. You probably won't remember me, but I was in your math class in 7th or 8th grade at Mission Middle School. My name is Leslie Diaz, and I thought I was always bad at math. But when I had you as a teacher, I realized maybe I wasn't bad at math. I just lacked confidence. Long story short, I remember you made me stay after school several times to tutor me, and to help improve my grade in class, you mentioned you'd give me a few extra points if I presented to the class some information about a famous Latina mathematician. I did, and I remember it being one of the first times I'd ever presented in front of a class. I was so nervous. However, it did make me realize it wasn't so bad and increased my confidence. I'm now a graduate of UC Berkeley undergrad and will be starting law school at UC Berkeley School of Law this fall. I currently live and work in San Francisco, California in intellectual property patent litigation as a paralegal. I can speak from experience that you making me do all that work made a difference in my life."
Yeah. That's huge.
That's huge, right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
what's remarkable about it as we think about equity, as we think about reducing the predictability of who succeeds and who fails, she didn't cite this, she didn't cite her success as being, in a class of this amazing, creative teacher who raps and things like that. She says, you just made me do the work, right? And
Yeah.
that's one of the things that we sometimes lose sight of, I think, as educators is, you know, don't forget, like, we got to just make the students do the work. Yes, we need to pay attention to their social and emotional,
Yeah.
well-being and their relationships and things like that. But really, truly caring for our students, truly caring about our students also means that we've got to just make sure that they get those academic skills that they need in order to progress. Students come to our classroom for the relationships, but they leave our classroom because of the academic content that they learn. We don't want students who repeat our class over and over again because they love us so much, right? We want students to go out into the world with the academic content and to use that to be successful in their lives. And so a lot of times, when this question of equity comes up, one of the things that I often say is that, we've just sometimes got to stop and do the work.
Yeah. Can you, and again, I'm going to, not push back, but talk a little bit more about this idea of collaboration, because like when you were teaching in your school, how did you ensure that in your teams and in your school, how did you ensure that if somebody didn't get Mr. Kajitani, that they were still going to have the same kind of experience in terms of leaving that classroom knowing some of the same basic information, so they had a chance at the next grade level, because that's truly important. And so what did it look like for you, as the teacher, the California Teacher of the Year, helping to influence your teammates to make sure that they were, and again, you're not going in and saying you have to do it this way, but how do you work in such a way where you're on the same page in terms of some of the same basic skills that all kids need to master?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. As we often think about, the most critical factor in the success of a classroom and a teacher and their students is, the teacher in front of the classroom. But oftentimes the most critical factor in the success of an entire school is really the relationship of the adults in the building. And so one of the things that I think is critical to collaboration among the adults, is really running effective meetings and being able
Yeah.
to run effective meetings. All of us, all of us have been in meetings where we thought, geez, this could have been an email, or all of us have sat in meetings that were just horribly boring and ineffective, where the wrong things were getting discussed. But when we are taking the time to really have effective meetings where we are digging deep into collaborative lesson planning, into looking at data for students, one of the most transformative things that we ever did as a group of teachers was we started grading the work of students that were not ours, right? That were not
Yeah.
specifically enrolled in our classroom. As obvious as that sounds, I had never done it before. And
Yeah.
I realized when I was just looking at the information and, the learning that was happening in the sample or the test or whatever it was that we were looking at, and I was looking at it from purely, an academic point of view and grading it based on the standards without bringing my own biases into, the student, oh, but that student, I know that they can do it, so they just made a little mistake here and things like that.
Yeah.
At first it was a little bit harsh, but it ended up, I think, being one of the most compassionate things we did, because we were able to start looking at academic performance from I think, a much more objective point of view. And then from there, the group started talking about, okay, what standards do we need to cover more of? How are we teaching this? And then a more
Exactly.
collaborative culture
Yeah.
started to, so instead of always starting with the teachers and what we need to do to collaborate better, sometimes we just start with the students and looking at, what is it that they're doing? What is it that the data is telling us?
Yeah.
And then we go, okay, now what do we need to put in place as teachers in order to get that done?
And I think that kind of conversation, that kind of collaboration really actually is a great professional learning opportunity, because, you may have given an assessment or the same assessment, and let's say the other teacher, the teachers, was more effective teaching a skill. And so you might be asking that teacher, what did you do? And so that teacher might be able to share some of the things that they've done. So that, again, collaboration in itself is morally neutral, but
Yeah.
collaborating on the right work and putting more tools in our toolkits, that's why we collaborate. We collaborate because we want to put more tools in our toolkits to become better teachers, so more kids will be successful.
Yeah. And it's interesting, I worked as a data coach for a school district for a couple of years. And so I'd go around to different schools, work with a teacher. Let's, take this data, that data, let's look at it, let's decide what to come up with. How do we put it into lesson plans?
Sure.
And it was remarkably noticeable. It was just so noticeable from school to school. Some groups would meet and, somebody would have really good test scores and they'd be up there leading the meeting and talking about, and then the person who had the low test scores was sort of sitting in the corner, kind of feeling demoralized, feeling like they weren't that good a teacher because their scores were lower, or their data was different than everybody else's. And then at other schools, oh my gosh, how did you do that? Exactly what you said. How did you do this? How did you teach that? What were you paying attention to? And so just those questions that we ask while we're collaborating
Yeah.
makes a huge difference in the culture of the school, of the learning. Just like I would say that the culture of any family is formed around the dinner table, I would say that the culture of any school is formed right there at the staff meeting. The culture of any department is formed right there during the meeting. That's where we determine as adults how we get along, how we communicate, what we talk about. And so, putting some effective meeting practices into place and really getting comfortable with each other
Yeah.
is transformative for our students.
Yeah, I think one of the things that I always, try to relate to my staff as the principal, one is that I'm the lead mistake maker, and that we're all going to make mistakes
Yes.
as a staff, and that we want to model that for our students. The other thing is that this isn't about good teacher, bad teacher in terms of test scores. It's always about, effective practices. And so we're not going to, look at somebody as a good teacher or bad teacher. It's not about sorting and selecting teachers. It's not about ranking teachers. It's not about evaluating teachers. It's about looking at this essential skill that we as a team said is so essential to the student's success, that we all need to be on the same page. And so we're going to be vulnerable. I'm going to be vulnerable with Alex. Alex, I don't teach this skill very well. Can you help me? Because if we set the culture in our school on this team that they're no longer your kids and my kids, they're only all of our kids, and we're all trying to get them across the finish line,
Yeah.
then we're going to be more willing to actually share practices with each other because these are all of our kids.
Yeah, and one of the best things that I ever heard was that data, the data does not belong to the teachers. It actually belongs to the students, right? And
Yeah.
early in my career, I'd get good test scores, or my students would get good test scores. I'd be like, yes, I'm the man. I'm so effective. And then one year, my test scores weren't so good, and I was like, oh, I suck. I'm not effective. When really the conversation was, okay, you know what? This isn't about you. This isn't, this isn't your data. This is
Yeah.
your students' data. So let's look at that and let's talk about what they need, not what you need to either inflate or deflate your ego.
Yeah, Anthony Muhammad says it really well. He says data is not condemnation, it's information.
Yeah.
So if we use it as information, it really is just more for us to gather in order for us to get better and better, right? And so I think that's really important. Hey, I want to switch to this book just quickly because I wanted to read, Harry Wong, a part of his foreword, because I think it's really important, and I just wanted you to talk to it. I remember the first time I met Alex Kajitani. I had just finished speaking at a conference when he approached me and introduced himself as a new teacher in a struggling inner city school. We chatted a bit, and he thanked me for my work. Before turning to leave, he handed me a CD filled with rap songs he created that he said were helping his students learn mathematics lessons he was teaching. Given that I'm more of a Broadway musical type, it took me at least a week before I looked at these rap songs. I'm paraphrasing. But from the first beat, I realized that what Alex had created was much more than a collection of songs. He had created a solution that got his students engaged, gave them the skills they needed to learn the concepts he was teaching. And I think that's what it's all about. And so your life's work, and I followed you in terms of relationships and engagement, and your book 101 Teaching Tips for Online Teaching. It really is about how do we make that connection? How do you make it relevant? How do you make it relevant for those kids coming to our classrooms? So you said something early on when you read that email from your former student. She said you had her do something like a paper on a Latina
Yeah, she had to do a
presentation.
Yeah,
That was relevant to her, right?
absolutely.
So those kind of things, we have to make sure that we know what they're bringing to the table. And so it wasn't the rapping. I mean, the rapping was a connection, but what was your thinking in terms of, when you're saying, I'm drowning here, I'm struggling, truly, what do you say to those new teachers? I know you have a lot of tools, but what do you say to those new teachers? Because a lot of them come in, and in your book, you talked about how many, like 18%, leave within the first 5 years. And so how do we make sure that we hold on to these people? And as well, as you say in your book as well, teaching never gets easier. It doesn't get easier. It's still very difficult. We have difficult years at year 25.
Yeah.
We might be more experienced, but it's still always a hard profession.
Yeah, and that I think, one of the things, if a new teacher, if any teacher really were to ask me, like, what is the number one thing that I can do in order to continue to want to teach, in order to come back next year, in order to be effective in my practice, my ones, I've got a lot of advice to give,
Yeah.
but if it came down to one thing, it always comes down to surround yourself with good people, right? I mean, what's funny is, in my 7th year of teaching, I was named California Teacher of the Year, right? In my 8th year of teaching, I got assigned that class, right?
Yeah.
Everybody listening has had that class at some point. Like, it is the class that made me drive home crying every single night, right? And of course, what was worse is I just been named California Teacher of the Year. So everybody wanted to come to my class to see what I was doing. And
Right.
they kind of walk out going, what's up? That dude's not that good, right? Because I had, this class that I was having a really hard time controlling. And then one day our dean of students came in. He needed me to sign a form or something. It was totally unrelated. And he watched for a while. He came back after school and he goes, "Tough class, huh?" I said, "Yeah, you don't even know." He goes, "Hey, let me help you." And I said, huh, all these years, I was telling my students, if you need help, don't be afraid to ask. It
Yep.
never occurred to me to just ask for help from some of my colleagues.
Yeah.
He and I were able to brainstorm some ideas, put some strategies in place, and things got better and better from that day on. And so, when we surround ourselves with people who can help us in terms of, with our pedagogy and our expertise, when
Yeah.
we surround ourselves with people who, are just who uplift our soul and who fill our lives with joy, when we surround ourselves with people who are interested in our well-being and who are interesting themselves, everything gets better, and everything sort of continues to progress. Of course, the opposite is true as well. When we surround ourselves with toxicity, that's
Yeah.
ultimately what we become. And so, if it comes down to one thing, I really think just as my mom always would say, in high school, you're going to be known by whatever friends you make and whatever friends you hang out with. I think that we really become who we surround ourselves with, especially in this teaching profession.
Yeah. Yeah. And I heard you say a couple things, and I think it's really important because it doesn't matter who the teacher is. No teacher has all the knowledge, skills, experience, expertise to reach every single child. And
Yeah.
so you have to be able to reach out. It's kind of like that medical model. I had a hip replacement a few years ago, and before I went to a hip doctor, and he said, "Well, I'm not a hip surgeon." He said, I can tell you what's wrong, but I need to actually refer you to somebody else because I don't have that expertise." And then that hip surgeon had to consult with other people. And so it's important to use our collective wisdom in order to reach every single child. And I really appreciate you even being honest and transparent and saying, I was California Teacher of the Year and I struggled and I needed to ask somebody, or somebody reached out and said, I might have some tips for you. I think that's
Yeah.
so important in our profession. I think we've come up and we've been socialized to think that we have to know it all, and
Yeah.
that's just not possible.
Yeah, I always encourage teachers to think of themselves really as, you know, not to blow out the analogy, but to think of themselves kind of like a tree, right?
Yeah.
And so we're a tree, but really our network of colleagues, of teachers, of friends is our root system, right? What determines whether a tree weathers a nasty storm, right? It's not the size of the tree, it's not the height of the tree, it's not the location of the tree, it
Yeah.
is the tree's root system.
Yep.
And sometimes the trees get different nutrients from different roots, right? That the roots serve a different purpose, right? And so, we don't have to go, if we're having a problem, if we're having an issue with classroom management, we don't always have to go to the same person. We've got a root who we can, tap to help us with classroom management. If we need some strategies for our English language learners, then maybe that's a different person. And so
Exactly.
it's that ability to pull from our roots, but at the same time, we want to grow our roots. We want those roots to be intertwined with other roots of other trees, and we want to make sure that they stay healthy as well.
That's a great analogy. I love that. I'm glad we have
Yeah.
it on tape. Hey, let's talk a little bit about parents. Um, in your book, you talk about really communicating with parents, and there's always this kind of push and pull, or catch 22, because we want parents are icing on the cake. We want, actually they're more than icing on the cake. We need them, but there are times when they're not going to be available, and so how do we make sure that, one, we are reaching out, engaging, making sure that we're involving parents, but also not making excuses if parents aren't available, and then we take it out on the child.
Yeah, that isn't that the truth. I think about one of this amazing experience that I had once where I had a parent conference schedule. I was really struggling to connect with a student. And so I had a parent conference scheduled. His name was Michael. His mom was going to come in, and we were all set, 4 o'clock on Thursday afternoon kind of thing.
Right.
4 o'clock comes and goes. She never shows up. Next day, I said to Michael, I said, "Hey, what happened? Your mom was supposed to, come for a conference." He said, I don't know. I said, does she usually miss appointments? He said, well, she goes to church 3 nights a week. She never misses that. And I realized, she absolutely can go places. She absolutely shows up places.
Yeah.
She just wasn't showing up for me.
Yeah.
Right. And so I had at that point to go, okay, what can I do to sort of build this relationship with the mom so that, I'm on her list of places that she will show up at. Right. And so I think that's one of the critical, factors is, first of all, just not taking it personally.
Yeah.
And realizing it's not necessarily a reflection on you. It's not a reflection on how much she does or doesn't care about her child's education or anything like that. But sometimes we do just have to get a little bit creative. And so I'll give you a couple of strategies and skills that I've used to connect with parents. Is that,
love to hear it.
Yeah, first of all, this is one of my favorite ones. I actually learned this from one of my friends who's a toy salesman, and he has to he has to cold call toy stores all the time to see if he can make an appointment to get in with their manager in order to show them their latest line of toys, to see if they want to sell them. And so what you do is you call, and if maybe somebody answers, or maybe you leave a message or whatever, but somebody answers the phone other than the parent, and you ask for the parent. No, she's not here right now, or they're not here right now. And you say, okay, no problem. Let them know that I'm going to call back at exactly 8 o'clock tonight. Right now, if you say something like that, you have to call back at 8 o'clock that night. Otherwise, you lose credibility really, really quickly.
Sure.
But most of the time, what happens is you call back at 8 o'clock, you've essentially made an appointment, right? And they answer, and they are expecting your call. So that's one way. Instead of, oh, could you please have her call me? Please have them call me, right? Make the appointment right then and there. So just a little sales trick. The other thing that I really like to do with regards to connecting with parents is to remember, parents aren't teachers, right? They don't have teaching credentials. And so what I see a lot of times is a parent will ask their kid a question, the kid won't answer immediately, and the parent will just jump in and tell them the answer.
Right.
They haven't been trained on things like wait time, right?
Sure.
So I'll actually tell parents and teach parents, hey, there's a really cool strategy that we learned as teachers. Anytime you ask your child a question, in your head, silently count to 10 and just give them a chance to answer and process that question, right? Don't just jump in and answer it for them. Or I'll teach them, the I do, we do, you do, strategy. And so just arming the teachers, or excuse me, the parents, with a couple of teaching strategies that they can easily use. Now they feel like they're a partner in this teaching thing. And when they feel like they're a partner, now they're going to be way more willing to connect, to build that relationship, and to answer your call when you call, because, now we're working together for to help their child be the best possible version of themselves.
Yeah, I love that, Alex. One of the things that I heard you say again is giving parents some tools. I always go in with the attitude that parents want the best for their kid. They're doing the best they know how. And we have many parents who did not have a good experience with school. So there's some trauma there. And so talking to a teacher, talking to an administrator, there may be some latent trauma that's happening, because they're having flashbacks to when they were in school, and so they automatically become defensive.
Yeah, why would they want to come on campus after the experiences they've had?
Yeah, and so I think giving parents tools to help their children, starting the school year off with positive phone calls to every child in the classroom, so parents know that the teacher cares and the teacher sees something positive in their child. I think those are really important, and I think one of the things that you said is it's truly important for you to make sure that you're kind of just persistent. Like you call and say, I'm going to call back at 8. And that's something that I really actually never thought about in terms of just scheduling a time, even with the person who's not there, because
Yeah,
then, I
even
mean,
if you have to leave a message, yeah, just
yeah,
do it on the message.
yeah. I mean, I love that. Um, and so when you have a parent who's just not available, um, and we all have those parents at times, your focus has to become right on that student.
Yeah,
And I mean, again, we want parents involved, but at some point, you're going to say, I'm the difference maker
yeah.
to this student. And so, what do I need to do to make sure that I am in loco parentis when he or she is in my classroom, in my school? I mean, I think that's really, really, really important.
I think so as well. And I also think that, as teachers, look, we're going to do what we need to do to try to connect with parents. And sometimes you just can't, right? And as much as I want to say, like, you got to do whatever it takes and you got to keep pushing and you got to keep going and things like that, there also is a point of diminishing returns
Yep.
where, you know what, I can continue to pursue this or try to, or get frustrated about this or whatever, or I can just take those 5-10 minutes and, just as we were saying, just help the kid with a specific skill that they need, and understanding, look, all of us come to school with, strengths, with weaknesses, with challenges and things like that. But the most effective time that we spend with our students is the time that we are right in front of them, working with them. And so, to not get too wrapped up in, you know, this challenge, that challenge with the parent kind of stuff, and just get back to, again, doing what we do best, which is explaining things to students, building the
Yeah.
relationship, and keeping it engaging.
Yeah. Hey, how do you make sure that we're not becoming victims of the public instead of really helping people, helping our profession, helping educators become the news purveyors? Like we need to be sharing what's the great things that are happening in our building, instead of taking in so much. Oh, they're not doing this, they're not doing that. We have to be proactive. So how what are strategies for us to be proactive in terms of sharing our stories in our buildings and in our profession?
Yeah, that is a great question, and I think very critical right now. As
Yeah.
as we see all sorts of things from A to Z, and then some in the media. And so really, I think there's three things. First of all, and you already said it, is sharing stories, right?
Yeah.
Sharing the stories about the students, about the experiences, about the teaching and the teaching life, right? People love to hear stories. People, remember stories. And so it doesn't have to be the story, the epic story about the time you hiked Mount Kilimanjaro or you pulled somebody from a burning car or something like that, right? It's
Right.
just these funny stories, these human stories, these authentic stories about our interactions with our students. And we tell those to our friends, we tell them, at the dinner parties, kind of thing.
Yeah.
And those stories continue to live on, in and that way, in someone's mind, when they see the news story about the negative thing, they think about Brian and the story that he told them
Right.
about him and his student. And so that's one way. The other way is, I think that what a lot of teachers don't know, or that a lot of educators don't know, is that a lot of media is created, a lot of news media, newspapers, news shows, things like that, is created because somebody picked up the phone and told the news reporter about it, right?
Yeah.
We don't have to wait for a news reporter to to come to our school. Rarely are they going to come to our school and say, hey, what's going on here? I want to do a story, right? My wife, her first job out of college was as a journalist. And so she was under contract to write 10 stories a week. And she said that anytime somebody called with a possible story, she would jump on it because she had only had, she only get hit 5 of her 10 stories, and she was looking for stories.
Yeah.
And so very simple. You open up your local newspaper, you find out who the education reporter is, and you just email them and you say, hey, I'm doing this really cool thing in my class. I thought you might like to come cover it. We're doing this great, theme day at our school. Thought you might like to cover it. Sometimes they'll come, sometimes they won't. Sometimes they'll answer your email.
Yeah.
Sometimes they'll answer it too late. But if you're, what I've always thought is, if we're doing something in education that is remarkable, we have an obligation to tell other people about it. And so I got very good at just I had a relationship with a couple of reporters, and anytime we were doing a story or we were doing something kind of cool in our class, I just let the reporter know. Sometimes they'd come, sometimes they wouldn't, but I'll tell you, when they came and did a story, I mean, nothing, nothing is better to create a positive atmosphere
That's
for the
huge.
school. And for the, I mean, the students were walking around for the next week like they were movie stars,
Yeah.
because they had been in the newspaper. And that can really transform not necessarily the culture of the school, but the perception of a school
Sure.
when it is on the news. And these days you don't have to wait. Also, you can get out the video camera, you can create your own video, you can create your own messaging
Yeah.
on social media, and you can share that. And so there are wonderful things happening at schools every single day. It's just that we often don't take the time to create the messaging around that.
Yeah, I love what you just said, and also it really is about creating a culture of celebration just in your school, and we as educators in general are kind of modest, and we don't want to
Yeah.
toot our horns, but we can't afford to not do that any longer. And it's not about bragging; it's about sharing the great things that are happening in our schools, in our districts, around our country, so people truly are understanding that we're doing a lot of great work.
Yeah.
My first 2 years as a principal in a pretty challenging school, um, we did not make adequate yearly progress, but we were making progress. And
Right.
so I said, we're going to tell our story. If a student was, a fifth grade student was reading at a second grade level, but did not pass the state test, but grew 2 years in reading in that year, that's a victory. That's a celebration. We have to tell that story to combat the narrative that that kid did not pass the test. And
Yeah.
we're not using names, but we have to tell those kind of stories. 80% of our students grew a year and a half or 2 years in their reading this year. But the state test says this. But this is what we say. This is a great teaching that's happening.
Yeah.
And if we keep doing that, it will snowball. We'll put more marbles in the marble jar, and it will outweigh the negativity that is not always, most of the time, it's not accurate.
Yeah. Yeah, a friend and colleague of mine, Claudine James, I was giving a presentation on teacher leadership, and I said something to the effect of, look, if you're doing something amazing in education, you have an obligation to tell other people about it. And so she was doing these really cool grammar lessons, and she ended up, she really took that to heart and said, okay, I've got an obligation to tell other people about this. So she started her own TikTok, channel and or account, and now I think she's got like 3.5 or 4 million viewers who
Wow.
tune in every day for her. And she's got a whiteboard. She does her grammar lessons. But there it is. Like, people are hungry for good information. As educators, we've got to, I think, take some time to just let other people know about that. Not necessarily at the expense of, all of the other things that we have going on and things like that. But if I do believe if we're doing something remarkable in education, we should take the time and tell other people about it.
Yeah. And so we're getting ready to wrap up. I really appreciate your time, Alex. This has been wonderful. And this is why I started my podcast, because I wanted to make sure that I highlighted the wonderful things, the wonderful people, the wonderful authors like you who are making our world a better place, kid by kid, child by child, teacher by teacher. And when we do that and we start to make it snowball, I truly believe we're not going to be able to stop it. And so if we can, and it's not false positivity. We know all the challenges that we have in our profession. We know that we have kids who are not making it, and we have to keep working and working and working at it. But we also know how hard we work as a profession and what we do for these kids and families. And we have an obligation, as you said, to share it with the world that this is who we are. This is our profession, and we are not running anywhere. We are proud of the work that we do every single day.
Yeah, very, very true. And it's been an honor and a pleasure to be on your program.
Well, I appreciate it, and I always end. My dad passed away a couple of years ago, and at his funeral, I use this old African proverb. It says, "As I go, I am wearing you," meaning that all the people who have touched my life positively and some, negatively, I'm wearing, and I'm representing those people. Is not Brian Butler. I have all these people who I'm wearing who have helped me become successful, and I'm still learning and I'm still struggling in areas. But what I say is, after my show, is now I am wearing Alex Kajitani, because all the things that I learned from you tonight, I researched, I read, I watched your TEDx talk, which was fabulous. If you all haven't seen his TEDx, you all have to see it. It's fabulous. But it's really important for us to make sure that we're out front, being proactive and helping to share what great things, what great people we have in our profession, and not wait to be reactive to say, oh, by the way, we are doing a good job. And so again, my friend, thank you so much for being on a conversation with Brian, and I hope to talk to you very soon.
Excellent. Thanks so much. And thanks to everybody watching and listening today.
Dot and give it all you got. Just line up the dot and give it all you got. Come on, line up the dot and give it all you got.